The National Football League has dominated television for decades. Even as far back as the early 1980s, the NFL has been the dominant sport league on American television. And these days, the numbers are even higher than ever. Of course, it really does help to have record snowfall cover most of the United States on a Sunday afternoon where nobody has anything else to do, so that people who have enough electricity can just watch the NFL playoffs on TV, you know what I'm saying? But there's an interesting aspect of the NFL's television dominance that nobody really talks about, and that aspect is actually pretty simple. It's that the NFL really was not a popular television sport, at least not in the beginning. Famously, the October 22nd, 1939 Eagles at Dodgers game in Brooklyn was the first NFL game broadcast on live television. However, even though Wikipedia will tell you that it showed the NFL was more technologically advanced than the other sports leagues, the truth is that nobody actually watched the broadcast. The truth is that the television broadcast is mentioned nowhere in any of the newspaper accounts of this game. And of course, the real story here is that the Brooklyn Dodgers only drew 13,000 fans for that home game. This is a sign that the NFL really was not as popular as you might think back in those days. Even on a late October Monday morning in Brooklyn, the big news stories in the sports section of Brooklyn newspapers were all about college football. Nobody cared about professional football. And nobody had cared about television at that time. I mean, people had heard of it, maybe, but the claim that NBC is like the first to broadcast this television game and it was so amazing that it was the NFL and stuff like that, it really doesn't matter. Nobody watched this. After all, there was no television listings in the newspapers in 1939. There were only radio listings like this one from the New York Daily News. Now, it is true that certain radio units were advertised as being television compatible or television ready, whatever that meant. It wasn't clear at that time what it meant. Television was still something in the future. It was a new futuristic innovation in a radio-centric world. It's hard to find reliable statistics, but it seems that there were only 7,000 television sets in the entire United States by the end of 1941, and there were something like 19,000 in all of Great Britain. And watching television usually meant going to a specialty shop like Binders in Trenton, New Jersey. Anyway, anytime you see anybody talking about television before World War II, you need to take whatever it is that they're saying with a grain of salt. Television was not widespread, and you couldn't just go buy one. You didn't have stations all over the United States. Everything was divided up according to radio logic, and everybody thought about radio, not television. And that continued to be the case until the early 1950s, which is when things finally took off. The 1948 NFL championship game, the infamous Philly Blizzard, was the first championship game to be televised. Of course, because the game was on ABC, the reach was extremely limited. ABC had something like 5 stations by December 1948, and even the newspapers in Chicago didn't feature any notice that this game would be on television. While football was being used in television advertising back in those days, the limited number of television networks made following a season on TV absolutely impossible. Your best bet was to find a theater or a restaurant near New York City that had the new technology. Actually, the biggest thing that the NFL had to worry about in 1948 was not television, and it wasn't the number of people watching its championship game. Now, it was a little thing called the All-American Football Conference. The AAFC had a product that was arguably better than the NFL, and it seemed to be winning. There were early words of a truce between the rival leagues, though it was painted up as a surrender by the NFL. And by the way, the AAFC playoff game between the Bills and the Colts was also shown on television the next day. The truth is that owners of sports teams everywhere treated television with suspicion back in those days. Even college football, the true football power of that time, was worried about what television would do to attendance. And actually, you still see some of those concerns today, especially in the world of college football. So for example, when we worry that bowl games are dying off because people would much rather watch the big playoff games that come a little bit later on television, we're really worrying about the same thing that we worried about back in the 1940s. The problem, of course, is that people would much rather watch a game featuring, good teams on television than pay a bunch of money to go watch a bunch of crappy teams play in person. Of course, by 1950, television sets were much more common. Models like this old Muntz TV cost hundreds of dollars less than the competition. They were created and sold by a man they called Madman Muntz, a businessman who cut costs like crazy. The Muntz TV didn't have all the tuning capabilities that the expensive sets had, but it would work in cities, and some of these models actually still work to this day. And so those who lived in larger metropolitan areas could pick up a relatively reasonably priced television set and experience the miracle of television for themselves. Not enough people talk about Madman Muntz and the difference that he was making. And actually, the push towards cheap television sets and making the technology accessible to the masses wound up having a dramatic impact on the power of television, especially as an advertising medium. But you need to understand that none of the businessmen at that time understood any of this. In 1950, the Los Angeles Rams televised every one of its football games, a move that other teams thought was reckless. For fans, the argument was that a television investment would give them access to a much wider variety of games from around the country and for cheaper than attending in person. That was exactly what football teams worried about, both in the pros and in college. And the focus was on figuring out ways to limit live broadcasts in order to save gate receipts. As a result, a lot of the early broadcasts were actually compilations of pre-recorded highlights like this Oklahoma A&M at Oklahoma game from 1953. Anyway, that set the stage for the NFL's first coast-to-coast television contract, which was with the old Dumont network starting in 1953. Now, you would think that a nationwide television deal would have helped the NFL out, right? And you would be wrong. Dumont's plans were created in the middle of May 1953. The idea was to televise select games each week throughout the country, subject to certain blackout requirements. And those blackout rules were really complex, especially when you consider how limited Dumont's reach was. So Dumont's real problem was that it was really a newcomer to the broadcasting game. CBS and NBC were the major players in the world of radio broadcasting. ABC, of course, had originally been known as the NBC Blue Network, which was separated from the Red Network because of antitrust concerns in the early 1940s. Now, Dumont might have been one of the first networks to the television game, but it didn't have the stars that the other networks had, and more importantly, it didn't have the reach. In other words, it didn't have the affiliate stations. Dumont's biggest problem was a freeze on new television station applications that the FCC imposed back in October 1948. There was apparently some concern that there would be an explosion in the number of stations around the country, which would cause the quality of television service to deteriorate rapidly. The FCC lifted that freeze in April 1952 to allow new stations to use the UHF range, and yes, this was front-page news back in those days. However, most television sets in the 1950s were not able to get UHF stations out of the box, and there were no plans at that time to force that to happen. So if you wanted to watch UHF, you had to get one of these bad boys, a UHF converter. And then all you needed was to figure out how to attach this to your set or pay somebody who knew how to do that some money. Notice that nothing is color-coded or easy to understand. The point of all of this is that Dumont was a really small network that was basically incapable of expanding, certainly not in a way that could have realistically competed with the big three. Now, Dumont was technically larger than ABC in 1953, but it had fewer primary stations or stations that it owned and operated. And the FCC allowed United Paramount Theaters to purchase ABC back in 1951. This not only saved ABC from going bankrupt, but it gave ABC enough cash to eventually compete with the big boys. So basically, Dumont was already on the way out by the time the NFL signed that contract with the network. So on the one hand, having a major television deal was a plus for the NFL. But on the other hand, a lot of that coverage was limited to highlight films like this one. This was a little bit better than live television because the network could use a lot of close-up camera angles similar to the Game of the Week episodes NFL Films would make a few years later. But the highlights just aren't that much fun to watch, and the project was largely a failure.
Tobin Rote gets off a nifty toss to Howie Ferguson that's good for 24 yards and a first down on his own 48-yard line.
And in the meantime, NBC had been televising the Big Four Canadian football games. These are the Big Four teams from Eastern Canada at the time. Now, those games had been beating the pants off of NFL games in the ratings, and they were a really big symbol of how poorly the NFL was appealing towards its own United States audience. You see, Americans loved watching football back in those days just as much as we do now, but most of them couldn't even get Dumont stations, and if they could, the signal was weak at best. I'm also fairly sure that this is why Bowman's NFL football cards weren't much of a success. Bowman had a monopoly on the NFL football card contract in the early 1950s, and the cards do look pretty nice. But the truth is that few kids even knew who any of these players were. And so this 1955 set was Bowman's final trading card set ever. In fact, Bowman lost so badly to this Topps 1955 All-American football set that Bowman wound up leaving trading cards altogether. If the NFL had been more readily available on television, maybe none of this would have ever happened. Anyway, NBC took advantage of the death of the Dumont network by buying the rights to the NFL championship game, and we all know what happened in 1958. The 1958 NFL Championship took place after Christmas because the Giants and Browns had to play a one-game playoff to decide the Eastern Conference title. And the Sunday afternoon broadcast on NBC made it so that most of the nation could watch. I probably don't need to tell you much about that thrilling game and what it meant to the NFL. Of course, this is the famous game where a broadcast cable was accidentally unplugged in that climactic moment of overtime. This was also the game that had this famous third down scramble in overtime where the Giants just barely missed gaining a first down by a yard. The press, of course, loved controversy like this and ate it right up. And what you have to understand is that it's the drama and controversy that really makes sports on television worth watching. Unfortunately for the NFL, however, that's a lesson that it didn't quite understand back in those early years. The American Football League had a contract with ABC right off the bat. Now, the AFL's contract with ABC was a contract for every team in the league, not one in which individual teams had individual contracts. Meanwhile, NFL teams were supposed to negotiate with networks individually in accordance with the 1953 court ruling. It was that ruling that held the NFL back from creating a comprehensive single network package, which meant that different teams could have different contracts for different amounts of money. Now, this should sound familiar to you. This is the exact same problem that Major League Baseball faces today. The problem is that you had teams in those days with really small natural markets, like the Green Bay Packers, who would have been at a big disadvantage if they were competing for television coverage dollars with the New York Giants. And so the NFL did the one thing that you do when the judicial sector gets in your way. The NFL went over to the politicians. The result was the Sports Broadcasting Act of 1961, which allowed the NFL to negotiate its television rights as a whole entity rather than as individual competing teams. And as a result, the NFL's new contract with CBS for regular season games in 1962 was for a little under $10 million. This contract was the beginning of the NFL's regional coverage on television. Additionally, this ensured that fans could see their local team's road games. This was a policy that continues and is actually pretty strictly enforced to this day. Of course, the NFL still needed to have a good product to compete with the AFL, and there's a pretty strong argument that the brand of football the NFL offered in 1962 just was not good enough to compete. The AFL featured a much more open offensive game, one that was a lot more attractive to the television audience. Meanwhile, the NFL was much more focused on old-fashioned running-centric football. The American Football League featured a style of football that was wild and unpredictable, a style that actually is a lot more fun to watch than even today's NFL. And the AFL also offered incredible defensive hits like this one. Of course, this wasn't the first time that the NFL faced a lot of pressure from a rival league that was arguably offering a superior product, and the NFL didn't get up and run away. Instead, the NFL did with the AFL exactly what it had done with the AAFC a couple decades earlier. It made a merger. The decision to merge came suddenly in June 1966 with basically no forewarning. And of course, this was one of the best decisions the NFL ever made. The creation of the Super Bowl, originally called the World Championship Game, was an absolute genius move. In keeping with the current television contracts, both CBS and NBC televised that first World Championship Game at the same time, something that is unthinkable today. And when the two leagues officially merged in 1970, the NFL kept the agreements with both television networks. CBS broadcast the NFC games. Why? Because it had the old NFL contract. NBC broadcast the AFC games because it had originally had the AFL contract. And then those two networks would broadcast the interconference games depending upon who the visiting team was. And then the NFL figured out a way to get the third major network involved as well. Back in late 1965, ABC decided to not pursue an additional contract with the AFL when it signed a major deal with the NCAA, and this allowed NBC to get that AFL contract. But in May 1969, ABC and the NFL announced a new idea. This was Monday Night Football, featuring games airing around the country in prime time. Monday Night Football was a huge hit around the United States, in part because it was primetime football and in part because of the strong personalities of its broadcasters. And the sport looked great in primetime. Now, if you're keeping score, you can see here what it was that the NFL was able to do. So once the NFL had the ability to negotiate its television contract as a league, like as a single entity, rather than as individual teams, it could eliminate those discrepancies caused by media markets of different sizes. And because the NFL then decided to hold to 2 television contracts after the merger instead of going down to 1, and because it then added ABC as a Monday night experiment, the NFL was on all 3 major networks for the entire decades of the 70s and the 80s. Now, it's that combination there of centralized league contract and the high bidding from all 3 networks at once that made the NFL such an incredible success on television. Of course, over the years, the hype for certain events like this has died down. Monday Night Football these days is no longer the marquee matchup that it usually was back in the 1970s, and we also have Sunday Night Football to look forward to, and there's also Thursday Night Football, which has been a thing now for years. And all of that was only possible when the NFL was finally willing to embrace television revenue, even if that meant that some stadiums would not necessarily be filled with fans. Now, the best example of that is probably the story of the NFL in Los Angeles. For example, the Los Angeles Rams utilized the huge Memorial Coliseum for home games during the 1970s, one of the most successful periods in franchise history. The problem, of course, is that the team was rarely able to sell out the stadium, which had a seating capacity of over 90,000. As a result, Rams home games like this one were often blacked out in the Los Angeles market, which made it much harder for the team to attract new fans. It was sort of a downward spiral. The Rams eventually moved to Anaheim Stadium, which had a much more reasonable capacity, but this was a baseball stadium first and foremost. Meanwhile, the Los Angeles Raiders ended up playing in the Memorial Coliseum and ran into the same attendance issues that the Rams had faced. The thing is, the real problem here is not the attendance figures. I mean, if you've got a stadium with a capacity of 90,000 and you have a crowd of like 65,000 there, you've still got 65,000 paying customers. It's not bad. Now, the real problem is that the league did not understand that television is what helps attract paying customers at the gates. This is a misunderstanding that NFL executives have had going back to 1948. It's also a misunderstanding that you see in every other major sport in North America, in particular in Major League Baseball, where they just don't get this. It wasn't really until 2015 that the NFL really started playing around with like suspending these stupid blackout rules. And as far as I understand, the rules are on the books today, but maybe they don't enforce them quite as strictly. The truth is, though, that the NFL is more popular on television today than it's ever been. The NFL is really the only major sport in North America that has seen its ratings consistently increase over time. And these numbers show no signs of stopping, not anytime soon. Anyway, when you look back through all of this, it really is remarkable. The NFL was a basket case on television, especially in the early 1950s. But these days, it is so powerful that other networks refuse to air anything of quality at the same time that NFL games are scheduled to be played. And this is especially true in the playoffs.